Janice there yet?
I haven't turned this one on.
She probably is.
She probably is. She's probably waiting. She usually jumps on right away. There's a few others that check in, that check it out on Facebook Live too.
She was so glad that you recorded my installation.
Oh, good.
She was so happy that you had it on Facebook.
Oh, yeah.
I had a big congratulations on Facebook when I got home.
Poor soul. I know she misses this terribly.
Yes. I want to go get her and bring her home for a weekend.
All right. Okay. See, the reason you record everything is once you record it, then you have options, but you never have a second chance to record it. So
Right.
let's open with prayer. Lord, we thank you for this new day, and we thank you for the chance to continue to study the book of Ezekiel and to walk through it. And we pray, Lord, that you would give us wisdom as we continue to delve into this difficult book, and give us your peace. So we ask in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, last week we started Ezekiel chapter 8. Now, for our new folks, this Sunday school class is not something for the timid. We go through the Bible in a pretty rigorous way, and we study one book at a time, and we kind of jump around between books, and then we read through the book. Now, what that has meant for us is that we've been going into corners of the Bible that a lot of people often don't go into, because people usually read some of the nice passages out of Isaiah, some of the stories out of Genesis, and things out of the Gospels, and sometimes some things in Paul. But because we go through it one book at a time, sometimes people say, well, I don't know anything about the book of Ezekiel. So we say, okay, we'll go through Ezekiel. And then we start going through Ezekiel, and people are kind of shocked at what we find. And so then we go through and we try and piece it together. I don't know, I always enjoy this, because part of what this class does is helps me study in a more in-depth way through some of these books that aren't paid attention to. I don't know, maybe some of you have comments about why you come to this class and what you get out of it. Maybe for some of our first-timers today. Any comments about that? I mean, why on earth would you come to a class where we spend 75 weeks in the book of Revelation, almost a year in the book of Isaiah, and now we're going through this book of Ezekiel, which is wild. So, and you guys keep coming. Why do you keep coming?
Because you present the book with the history behind it.
Okay.
It's not just reading something and not knowing what's going on in the area at that time. It's the history involved in it also.
And also the review, a lot of times, for instance, between the heaven and earth and the temple.
Mm-hmm.
And, although, like with me, as I get older, sometimes I forget things that I don't remember. But then when we come back to class and he starts, well, you, I won't say he, but you start talking, and before you know it, you said, okay, and it's like you pounded it into our head so we don't forget it, and you're drawing little pictures on the board again. And so all of that helps, to remember things. And, of course, I have things I kind of record in my own head through God. But anyway, on the other hand, it's like a recorder when you do those things. And then when you start thinking about it, it's like, okay, he said this, he said that. And then you take some notes and put it all back together, and here we are.
And here we are.
Yep.
Well, let me give you, again, from some of our new folks, I don't want to drop you in the middle of it, and I think most of our regulars don't mind a little bit of review. Ezekiel, okay, let's see see if I can do this quickly. So, there's Egypt, and then, today there's Jerusalem about here. There's the Jordan River. Then way up here, there's Mesopotamia with Babylon and Assyria, and later the Medes and the Persians. Well, there's constant issues between the powers of the Fertile Crescent and the powers of Egypt. And these are perpetual empires. And the Hebrews are here in the middle. And so at the 11 o'clock sermon, we're going through the book of Kings, and we're talking about, we've just finished with Solomon, and actually today we're going to talk about the breakup of Solomon's kingdom. But part of what's at issue is the history of Judea, as the Romans called it, the Galilee, as the Romans called it, ancient Israel during David and Solomon's reign. It's always lived between the great Mesopotamian powers and the empire of Egypt. Now, what had happened, so Solomon has his reign, and during Solomon's reign, we know that Egypt at that point was dysfunctional, and these powers were dysfunctional, leaving a power vacuum that very much let David and Solomon, build a vital, powerful empire here. But that was only a few hundred years that they had this pause. And after that, these great civilizations once again begin exerting themselves. And when they exert themselves, for example, for Egypt, you have North Africa that they could go there. But you've got the Sahara, you've got the Nile. So Egypt and what would be called Kush down beneath them. Egypt, the main place for Egypt to exert power and influence is here. And one of the main places for the Mesopotamian cultures to exert power and influence is here. And so this area is constantly being fought over between Egypt and the Mesopotamian powers. And so that plays out then in this time of the Israelite kingdom after Solomon. Now, in 605 BC, the Assyrian Empire, which had destroyed the northern kingdom, is waning in power. And the Babylonian Empire, later more famously ruled by Nebuchadnezzar, we did the book of Daniel before we did Ezekiel, the Babylonian power is rising, and so Egypt, that had been subjugated by Assyria, sees Assyria failing, and sees Babylon rising. So Egypt is afraid of Babylon. And so Egypt decides it wants to march its army up here to assist Assyria to fight Babylon. At that point, good King Josiah, that the book of Kings likes, Josiah has a religious revival in Jerusalem. They find the book of the law. They start practicing the covenant again. Josiah and the southern kingdom of Judah here are very nervous about Assyria because Assyria basically destroyed the northern kingdom and dispersed the people. So they're kind of siding with Babylon. And so when Egypt marches its army up here, Josiah takes his army to challenge the Egyptian army, and Josiah gets killed and his army gets destroyed. But because Egypt just rode through here lately, that pretty much puts Jerusalem in the hands of Egypt. Josiah has 3 sons. The oldest son is a very competent son. Egypt takes him, deports him to Egypt, installs a lesser son. Babylon comes down and surrounds the city in 605 BC, takes up a bunch of exiles to Babylon. One of those exiles is a young man from the priestly tribe, from the priestly clan of the Levites, named Ezekiel. And they are living in a refugee settlement outside of Babylon. And Ezekiel turns 30 in that refugee camp. Now, him turning 30 is an important thing because at the age of 30, someone who is within the priestly tradition then would have the opportunity to be a priest in the temple. And he's looking forward to that. But now he has been deported to Babylon. Jerusalem is still intact. The temple is still intact. But he has been deported to Babylon, and he laments his situation. Now, there's another funny thing about Ezekiel that we have to deal with. A lot of scholars read the book of Ezekiel and have some questions about his mental health. And the more you read this book, the more you wonder, was Ezekiel schizophrenic? Because the wild, vivid images in the book of Ezekiel lead people to wonder, was he in his right mind? And actually, the book of Ezekiel, in terms of the Jewish canon, was one of the most debated prophetic books. Quite late, actually, into the 2nd and 3rd century, there was a lot of debate in the Jewish community if Ezekiel should be part of their Bible, because the book is so strange, and the visions so dramatic, and the judgments so harsh. But the Jewish community eventually agreed God spoke to his people through Ezekiel, and the Jews made these conclusions usually based on, over time, does the book ring true? Did the prophecies come true? I think this is part of the reason why Daniel in the Hebrew scriptures was part of the writings and not part of the prophets. But Ezekiel's part of the prophets. And so eventually the Jewish community embraced the book of Ezekiel. But now as we're going through the book of Ezekiel, we're realizing how strange this is. Now, most of the prophetic books that come out of this period are in poetry, which in the ancient world, things were written in poetry so that they could be remembered orally. And we know that because, poetry has meter, it has structure, and that helps people keep the words right over long periods of time. Ezekiel is different. It's written in narrative. And especially the first part of the book are all of these stories of visions that Ezekiel has, and also some of the crazy things that Ezekiel does. One of the things Ezekiel does is the Lord tells him, lie on one side of your body every day for every year of the northern kingdom's apostasy. So he lies on one side in his house for over 300 days. And the Lord says, and the people around you will tie you up and keep you in the house. This again leads to the wondering, did the people believe, what do you do in the ancient land when someone is mentally ill and you think dangerous? Well, you don't want to kill him because he's your family. So often you tie them up. When I was a missionary in the Dominican Republic, there was a guy who lived down the street from some friends of ours. And in the neighborhood, he was known as, or at least my friends called him, the screamy guy. Well, this guy was likely mentally ill. And so what the family did was pretty much keep him locked in a room. And they fed him and took care of him. But he was probably a schizophrenic. And if you know schizophrenics, they have dramatic outbursts often. And they see things that aren't there. And so the family kept him locked up. So it could very well be that part of what they did with Ezekiel when he would have, in the old saying, when he would have a fit, they would probably keep him tied up or locked up in his house. But here, the Lord seems to be working through this and using this to speak a word to Israel about their condition and about their situation. And so, as we've been going through the book, we've had all these visions and dramatic things happening. And last week, we started... let's see, Daniel is, not Daniel from, Daniel the Brazilian is looking for his ride. Marshall volunteered to pick him up. I hope she didn't forget. Okay. So in chapter 8, we have kind of a new vision section beginning. In the 6th year of the 6th month, on the 5th day, this is Ezekiel chapter 8. I don't know what page it is in the Bibles that are there. If you have trouble finding it, someone around you can help you. The elders of Judah were sitting before me. The hand of the sovereign Lord came on me there. I looked and I saw a figure like that of a man. From what appeared to be his waist down, he was fire. And from there his appearance was bright as glowing metal. He stretched out what looked like a hand and took me by the hair of my head. The Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven, and in visions of God, he took me to Jerusalem, to the entrance of the north gate of the inner court. So here we have the scene where Ezekiel's in his house, and the elders are with him. And we don't really know why the elders are with him. They could be there because maybe now they're getting a sense that Ezekiel is saying something important. They could be there because Ezekiel's been a problem. We don't really know why they're there, but while he's visiting there, Ezekiel has an out-of-body experience, and he sees this man coming up to him, and it's quite vivid, and the man comes up to him, and on top looks like glowing metal, and on the bottom looks like fire, and he comes up to him, and he grabs him by the hair, and he pulls him out of his body. And he transports him between heaven and earth. It's kind of like flying all the way from the refugee camp in Babylon all the way to Jerusalem. And they're going to the temple. Now bear in mind again that Ezekiel is wanted to be a priest and was a priest, but wasn't able to serve in the temple. And so this angel or this spiritual being then transports him to Jerusalem, and now he's going to see a vision of what's going on there. And there before me was the glory of the God of to the north gate of the inner court, where the idol that provokes jealousy stood. Now, we talked about chapter 8 last week, and we talked about the difference between jealousy and envy. And we talked about why in the Ten Commandments God says, "You shall not make for yourself a graven image of anything that is in heaven or on earth, and call it me." And we talked about, what is behind this very unique Hebrew. All the other nations of the world have images. And if they conceptualize a god, they conceptualize the god as common ones would be a fertile woman. So if you do archaeology in the ancient Near East, you find all of these little figurines of females with large breasts and wide hips. And these are fertility idols. Or you find, say, figurines of Baal. And Baal is kind of like Zeus. He's a storm god, and he's often got thunderbolts that he's holding. And so God is like a strong man throwing thunderbolts. At the service today, we're going to talk about 2 golden calves that Jeroboam makes. And here is Yahweh as a golden calf. And so the perpetual religious instinct of people all over the world was to try to represent God as something within his creation. But the Hebrews come along and God tells them, "You shall not make a representation of anything that is in the world and call it me." And last week we talked about why that is. How if, say, you were a maker of cakes, you wouldn't want to be represented by a cake. Because you are more than a cake. You are a maker of cake. You are not a cake yourself. And so to say God is a cow, or God is a fertile woman, or God is a storm god, diminishes how God is revealing himself. Because he's saying, I am more than you can conceive of. And if you try to distill me down into something that is the product of what I make, then you diminish me, and you must not do that. But now Ezekiel is taken from his place in the refugee camp, and he's brought to the temple, and he sees that what has happened in the temple is that they've set up a statue. They've set up an image. They've set up an idol. And this idol provokes jealousy. This idol provokes God's jealousy, because this is God's temple. You are envious of something that you don't belong. The Ten Commandments say, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. The reason you ought not to covet your neighbor's wife is because she is not your wife. You can be jealous of your wife because she is your wife, but you ought not be envious of your neighbor's wife because that wife does not belong to you. And that's the difference between envy and jealousy. So this image provokes jealousy because God says, this is my temple. And now they have taken an image, and we're not told whether this image was supposed to be Yahweh or whether this image was supposed to be, as was often the case now, in Jerusalem, they're under pressure from Babylon. What would often happen if you became a vassal of a foreign power, you would be required to put the god of the foreign power in your temple to demonstrate your allegiance to the city of Babylon. And we're not told what this image is. And so then God says, verse 5, then he said to me, Son of man, look towards the north. And I looked, and in the entrance of the north of the gate of the altar, I saw this idol of jealousy. He said to me, Son of man, do you see what they are doing? The utterly detestable things the Israelites are doing there. Things that will drive me far from my sanctuary. Now, this business about being driven from the sanctuary is the same thing that happens in the Garden of Eden, where basically God, when he does describe himself as similar to something in the Old Testament, for example, he says, I'm a consuming fire. And what you see in the stories of the tabernacle is that God and sin cannot exist in the same space. And so if God and sin is in the same space, either God will destroy the sin, or God has to leave, and in the case of the garden, and in the case here, because if God remains, what remains there will be destroyed. So it's God's mercy that sends him to leave, and that way God doesn't break out and kill everyone. But now when we get into chapter 9, we're going to see this gets more complicated. So what happens in the rest of chapter 8 is this being takes Ezekiel through the temple and shows how the temple has been corrupted by the people of Judah. And again, we talked last week, and so this is why I record it. So if you want to see what I said last week, you can go back and watch it on YouTube or watch it on Facebook. And we talked about why God would be upset about the adulteration of the temple. And then there's women worshiping. Basically, it was a mythological story about the cycle of the seasons. They were mourning for Tammuz. And then there was a group of elders that were worshiping the sun. And again, as I said last time, so I have a friend who often invites me to teach a lesson in his course. He has a course at the Art Institute here on myth and ritual and magic, and he asked me to present Christianity. And one of the things that you notice if you look at almost every mythological system, for example, the Egyptians, you have a sky god, and you have an earth god, and you have a sun god, and you have a moon god, and the stars are spiritual beings, and they're gods. And there's a god of the sea, and there's a god of this plant. And actually, if you read Augustine's City of God, the Romans had so many gods. You had a separate god for the hinges of the door. Then you had for the doorknob of the door. And Augustine goes into this, saying basically how silly this is. And then Augustine's dealing with the polytheism of the late Roman Empire. He does this. But one of the startling different things about the Hebrew story is that if you read Genesis 1, God calls order into being out of chaos, and he does this by creating these things. And the sun, for the Hebrews, is the sun. It is not a God that you pray to or try to relate to. It is a thing. Now, for us, secular, modern people, we hear that and we say, oh, well, of course, because the sun is a burning ball of gas out in the sky. But in the ancient world, nobody would have thought of that, because the world is inhabited by all of these spirits and beings and gods. But the strange thing of the Hebrew story is that they say there is one God, and he creates and calls these things into being. And so again, the reason that worshiping the sun or praying to the sun in the sky is offensive to the maker of that God would be, let's say, so Carol said I preached a good sermon last week. If you would start praying to my sermon, I would probably be flattered that I'm glad you appreciated the sermon and I'm glad you enjoyed it. But if Carol set up a little icon in her house and started lighting candles and had a little YouTube of my sermon running perpetually, I would say, Carol, I think we have a problem, because my sermon is something I made, okay? But it is not me. And so this is part of the reason that God says to the people of Israel, do not worship the sun, do not worship the stars, do not worship the trees. Worship the one who made these things. And that's why in Christianity, as following Judaism, one of the central divisions is the creator and the creature. And God says, you worship me alone. This obviously gets complicated when Jesus comes on the scene and Jesus says, I am the Lord. And now suddenly the disciples are like, oh. And if you read C.S. Lewis, he'll make the comment that wouldn't have made any sense in the rest of the pagan world. Because lots of people who were dramatic in some way, if we were ancient Greeks or Romans, it would be very fitting for us to say, LeBron James's mother was a god. And you say, well, because look at how strong and powerful and capable LeBron James is. The only way for us to make sense of this is to imagine that somewhere a god impregnated someone, and so LeBron James came into being. That would have been very common in the ancient pagan world. But amongst the Jews, no. Which is why when Jesus comes along and Jesus claims to be a son of God, now again, the Romans would hear that and say, there's sons of gods all over the place. Alexander the Great, sons of gods. Roman Emperor, sons of gods. But for a Jew, well, this, basically because of what happened in Ezekiel's time, these are things you stone people over. These are things you kill people over, which is part of the reason that the conservative religious community in Jesus' day, he's committed blasphemy, let's kill him. Simple. But here, of course, in Judaism and then Christianity, the creator-creature distinction is very hard and very determined. So you don't worship the sun, because the sun is a servant. It's not really it doesn't have personality. It's a thing, like the river, but it reflects the glory of God, but it is not God himself. So in chapter 8, you have all of this apostasy going on, and God is going through the temple with Ezekiel and basically saying, well, why have I allowed Jerusalem to be taken by the Babylonians? Because this is their great question. Because, again, and this actually energizes a lot of the Old Testament. If you understand the story of the Old Testament, here's the representation from Genesis 1. You have God in heaven. You have the seas below separated from the dry land. And in Jerusalem, you have God's house. What happens in the fall is the separation of heaven and earth. And what God does throughout the Old Testament story is reconnects himself and creates a witness on the earth. And the missional goal of this witness is that the nations will come to him. And for example, at 11 o'clock, I know I'm moving through all of this quite quickly. Reason at 11 o'clock, we're talking about when the Queen of Sheba comes and visits Solomon. This is God revealing himself through the wisdom of Solomon and the success of Israel so that the world can understand the rebellion that they are in against the God of heaven who truly owns the world. That's, in a nutshell, the story of the Old Testament. So what the Jews, understanding this, said, well, if this is God's mission, and if God is all-powerful, and if God is the God of heaven and earth, consequently, God won't let anything happen to us. Oh. So, Jeremiah deals with this in his book. God won't let anything happen to us. God can't let anything happen to us, because if God lets something happen to us, his mission to reclaim the world is over. So therefore, as long as we keep the temple here, God won't let Babylon hurt us. Now the question on their minds is, well then why did Babylon get to take all of these priests and all of these people from Jerusalem up to Babylon? And the answer to this question is, well, because Israel has not been faithful to the covenant. And that's what's going on here in the book of Ezekiel. And verse 12 in chapter 8, he said to me, Son of man, you have seen what the elders of Israel are doing in the darkness, each at the shrine of his own idol. They say, the Lord does not see us. The Lord has forsaken this land. Again, he said, do you see these things that they are doing? You will see them do things that are even more detestable. So again, what is happening in Israel is that they read the covenant in Deuteronomy, and here in the covenant it says, if they follow the Lord and keep his commandments, then the Lord will protect them. The Lord will help their crops to grow. The Lord will multiply their fortunes. And the people are saying, God isn't showing up. God isn't doing enough for us, so we need to work these other idols in secret. And that's how we need to have our jobs go well. That's how we need to stay healthy. That's how we need for our fields to do well. And so we're going to do all these other things. And here the Lord is telling Ezekiel, I know what's going on. Then he brought me to the temple. So then you have the women mourning in verse 14 and 15. Verse 16, you have the men worshiping the sun. And now in verse 17, we have something that's really important. He said to me, have you seen this, Son of Man? Is it a trivial matter for the people of Judah to do the detestable things that they are doing here? That's the question. Is this a trivial thing? And the obvious answer to the question is no. This is not trivial. Because Judah is saying, God can't let anything happen here because we have the temple. And God is saying, the temple cannot complete its function of revealing me if you are turning me into the shape of the paganism of all the surrounding peoples. In other words, God is saying, people can't come to my glory if you don't embody my glory, if you don't reflect me in your lives. People will not be able to know me because you don't look like me. And then he says something very interesting. Is it trivial matter for the people of Judah to do the detestable things they are doing? Must they also fill the land with violence and continue to arouse my anger? Now that's interesting, because we started talking about the temple, and now he's talking about violence in the land. What's the connection?
Well, if you live in violence, you're not keeping my commandments.
Okay. running a church on Sundays, I love when people always contact me on Sundays. It's like, what do you think I'm doing Sunday morning? You can't really just talk on the phone. So, violence is obviously a failure of the law. What's the connection between idolatry and violence?
There's a couple of things that come to mind. One is if you're praying to the idol for good things, the Lord is going to be very angry with you.
Okay.
The other thing that comes to mind is if the idol is not providing you with the response that you want, the blame has to go somewhere, so you're going to find someone to take your anger out on.
That's right. That's right. The impulse to idolatry is setting up something in the people. Now we've got someone else coming in. Hey, Pete.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. Daniel was planning on playing guitar, but it doesn't have to play guitar, I guess. Were you planning on bringing one?
I can get one from home.
Okay.
So maybe after the class, I'll zip home. Do we have a couple guitars?
We have at least Phillips red one, electric,
Okay. Okay. So
or the left-handed.
is he right-handed or left-handed?
I think he's right-handed.
We have a left-handed acoustic and we have Phillips electric guitar.
Okay.
So we'll zip home after and we'll bring them both.
Okay.
Okay. Relationship to an idolatry and violence. So basically what they have done with the temple is they've turned it into a pagan shrine. Well, what is at the heart of the religious motivation, even in our contemporary? Let me say this. As a pastor, we're here every Sunday, and I'm not making a comment on anybody who's new here for the first time. You gotta have a first time sometime. Often, someone will come into church, and they'll come in and it's like, "Oh, pastor, I got to join the church." It's like, whoa, slow down. You don't even know the church. Someone comes in, "I got to join the church. I got to join the church this week." No, we don't do that here, okay? We don't do any rushed things here. Why do you got to join the church? I already know one of the answers is going to happen. Usually, I had a fight with my husband. Or I ran out of money. Or my kid got arrested. Or my mother was in an accident. Or my uncle just died. What's going on? They have a need. They have a need. They have something in their life that they have found to be unmanageable. Now, if you get a big bill in the mail, but you have the money in the bank, you usually just take out the checkbook, you write the check, you pay the bill. You get a big bill in the mail and you don't have the money in the bank, and you realize there's no fast way to make the money, and nobody's going to loan you the money, what do you start doing? Praying. So just watch the news now after the hurricane in Texas, and I'll tell you what, so the news crews go to the person who is the most emotional at the moment. That's why they don't like putting Maury on TV too much, because Sacramento's going to flood! And Maury stands on TV and says, "Well, this is within the parameters of the system." The news doesn't like that. So they find the person that is freaking out the most, and this is usually the person that said, "Well, I'll ride this storm out." And so they stayed in their little dilapidated home, and the winds blew and the house blew down. And then when they get on the news, they said, "I was praying all night." Now their neighbor might know they never go to church. Their neighbor might know they never read the Bible. But boy, they're fervent that night. Why did they suddenly find religion in the middle of the hurricane?
That's all they need to comfort them.
That's right. That's right. They don't want to die. That's all they knew. And suddenly, that's why the saying, "No atheists in foxholes," which atheists really find annoying. But it's a stereotype and a generalization, but gosh, when we get scared and life is out of control, we look for a God. Okay, this is a human impulse. But we are not terribly discriminating people. And so that's why, let's say you've got, let's call them Abraham and Sarah, but a different Abraham and Sarah, and the problem is they can't have a child. Well, you don't, here in America, we say, well, we've got to go to a fertility clinic, and, we've got to do the sperm count. We've got to, in the ancient world, you'd go down to the end of the store and you'd say, give me one of them big-breasted, wide-hipped figurines. And we're going to put that on the shelf of the house. And before we have that goat and kill that goat, we're gonna put a little altar here, and we're gonna say, well, let's call that figurine. Let's call her Asherah, and say, oh, Asherah, my wife hasn't given me any sons. We offer this goat to you. Okay, so what's going on there?
Trying to bribe them into something.
That's right. And so it's like, Asherah, I'm giving you some attention, right? This is what you want, isn't it? Here, I'm offering you a goat. Won't you please have my wife bear a son? This is the heart of the universal human experience of religion. Now, this happens in churches all the time when someone comes in and says, my mother has cancer, please pray for me. Okay. Now, I'm not going to say, no, I won't pray for you, you pagan heathen. Get out of here with your need-based requests. In fact, in church, we will take lots of needs, but we bring them before God. But, so this is the heart of it. Now, what's the relationship between idolatry and violence? What is motivating, what motivated Sarah, the one in the book of Genesis, to say, Abraham, sleep with my servant Hagar? What motivated Sarah to take her quite likely younger servant girl and give her to her husband to have sex with? Now, we know the book of Genesis, that didn't turn out so good. But what's motivating Sarah? Desperation. What often is a motivation of violence? Desperation, anger, frustration. God is looking, God is saying, what happens in the temple gets played out in the street. What happens in the temple gets played out in the street. It's still true today. What happens in the church gets played out in your life. Because the church deals with what's of claims of ultimate value. Well, those aren't going to be disconnected with the other things that are going on in the mundane areas of your life. And so God is saying, well, this is a greedy people, and there are desperate people, and there are frightened people. Now, what is the posture of faith in times of desperation? What does faith look like?
It looks solid.
What's it?
It looks solid.
What? Say more about that.
Well, it looks like something that you really can hold on to. Something that you can believe.
Oh, that's right. Now, I am not going to tell you that faith doesn't sometimes look like desperation and fervent prayer and internal anguish. Why would I say that? There's probably the most famous story in the Bible of someone begging and pleading and sweating drops of blood. Who is that? Jesus. In the garden. So we ought never to say that faith doesn't, that if you feel anxious and terrified that you don't have faith. Because that is an aspect of it. But it is also solid. We don't find Jesus, and what would panic look like in the Garden of Gethsemane for Jesus? He'd run. Exactly. He'd run. He'd leave. Well, that connects us to a story in the Old Testament of Jacob, who, remember, he fled from Laban. Now he's got lots of flocks. He's got a couple of wives. He's got more sons by the wives and the servants. And he's fleeing Laban, and he's heading back home. And then he hears word that someone is coming to meet him with 400 men. And who is that someone? His brother Esau. And Jacob panics. And he's also a schemer. So he says, okay, let's put the stuff I least like out in front. And then the wives and the sons I least like second. Yeah, I know. And then my wife and my favorite son third. And then where does he fit? Last. Okay, so what does that reveal about Jacob's value system?
Self-centered.
Yes! He's a completely selfish man.
Paul, could I add something to desperation?
Sure.
Well, I haven't told you this before, and I'm not going to go into all of it, but in Acts 16, in the New Testament, concerning Paul and Silas, and when they were, in jail, and when the storm came and everything, and then the jailer had been probably asleep while he was supposed to be guarding them. But, and then when the storm rocked the doors open and everything, and he thought Paul and Silas and the other prisoners had fled. But when Paul said, no, we're still here. And what happened was that the jailer was so thankful that they had not escaped, because if they had escaped, he would have lost his life.
That's right.
So, but the thing about it is that what I'm getting at is that he was so thankful that he asked Paul, what must I do to be saved?
That's right.
And Paul told him to believe.
That's right.
So, but the whole story is that, let alone that, he and his whole family, after he, treated them, washed, cleaned them up and so forth, and then he took them to his house, fed them and everything, and he and his whole family became believers and they were saved. So, it's like out of desperation, here's, this story. I mean, I'm not going to say the rest of it. I read that part at the family reunion I went to, and when you're reading out of your International Bible, it's good one way. But when, like me, I took my little travel Bible, which is the King James Bible. And I started to read, and when I got near the end, wait a minute, that's not what it says in my Bible. Oh, God, I was so embarrassed.
But you're right, God uses desperation. So when that person comes into church and like, Pastor, I have to join the church today. Well, okay, I don't usually say. I said, well, let's just talk a little bit. What happened? I had a fight with my husband, or my husband left me. Okay, well, let's sit down, let's talk, and let's pray. Let's pray for your situation. Let's pray for your mother who has cancer. Let's pray for your child who's in trouble. And why don't you come back next week? 9 times out of 10.
They don't come back.
They don't come back. Something happened, their problem was solved, so here's another point about idolatry. If your only relationship is need-based, the relationship won't go further than the need. And so what we try to do is, let's invite people into a longer, durable relationship. And that gets to your point, Barbara, in terms of, it's faith looks solid. Yes, faith, we're panicking inside, but Jesus doesn't flee the Garden of Gethsemane and say, I'm getting back to Galilee where it's safe. He doesn't do that. He stays. Courage is, a lot of people think courage is not being afraid. No. Courage is being afraid and still doing the right thing. That's courage. Faith is being afraid and still holding the course. And the point here is that Israel, well, they're afraid, and they're going all off in other directions. And God is saying, you're not a witness to me. You're a witness to common, fallen, human religiosity. Because what you're doing here is what folks are doing everywhere. And here's the thing. Violence is the end result of it. Because if you're willing to break your bonds because of your panic now, you're willing to break bonds of social convention and internal restraint with your neighbor, well, why do people beat up on other people? That's always the why do spouses sometimes hit their spouses? Anger. They lose it. They lose control. Faith is the opposite of that. And so what God is saying is that here he's saying what happens in the temple gets played out in the street. Well, we just did chapter 8 twice. So that's okay. Because if you watch last week's video, we talked about other things than we talked about today. Because then when you get to chapter 9, then I heard him call out in a loud voice, "Bring near those who are appointed to execute judgment in the city, each with a weapon in his hand." And the vision that comes in verse 9, again, for those of us who walked through the book of Revelation, will sound very familiar. Because Revelation basically picks up this same image and redoes it. Because God says, okay, I'm going to give you the consequence of what's going on in the temple. And then we get into chapter 9. And then we get into chapter 10. And it's terrifying. And Ezekiel is horrified. And yeah, so we'll pick that up next week. Any questions or comments before we close? Marty.
A very mundane question. Could you tell me what do you happen to know? And I looked back and I couldn't find verse 17. Look at the end of it. Look at them putting the branch to their nose. Sorry.
Nobody knows what the answer to this question is.
Oh, okay, good.
And if you... So this is what happens in commentary. So you have the Bible. The Bible is the most studied book in all of human history. Because, the Bible is this fat. You think that's fat, you should look at all the books written about this book. So you have commentaries. And so if you do some of what I do, you read through what are called biblical commentaries. And people have been writing commentaries on the Bible ever since there has been a Bible. And so scholars weigh in, and scholars scour history, and they scour archaeology, and they try to find, and they look at the rest of the Bible and say, what on earth could they be talking about with this branch in their nose? And they haven't found anything. So basically, we have no idea what that is supposed to mean. You can kind of try and infer via context, but we don't have an outside historical reference to any branch in the nose.
I thought maybe incense or something.
Yeah, and so what you'll see in commentaries are just lists of theories about it. But unless we find... So what happens if you have something like this in the Bible? First you start and you look in the book of Ezekiel. Is this talked about anywhere else in the book of Ezekiel? No. Then you look in the rest of the Bible and you say, can you find a reference like this in the rest of the Bible? No. Then you look at other Jewish literature and you say, can you find anything in this in Jewish literature? No. Then you go to the archaeological record and say, can we find anything that refers to this in other ancient Near East? And basically, we have no idea how to connect a branch to a nose and how it makes sense in this context. So, good question, Marty. You're in good company asking this question. Let's close in prayer. Lord, we would like to imagine imagine that we are in control of ourselves and in control of our lives. And that's not really true. We have some degree of control over what we do, but we're very much dependent creatures, and we're formed and shaped by our habits and how we spend our time. And what this chapter highlights is that what's true in the temple gets played out in the streets. And this was true of Jerusalem, it's true of our lives, it's true of our nation. And it's an important thing for us to ponder. But Lord, we believe that all of this is part of this grand story of yours working through Israel and then the church, all the way up to us and to our lives and our world today. And we ask you, Lord, that you would lead us and mold us and shape us. And Lord, we are naturally idolatrous. And we even take the things that you give us and turn them into idols. Help us, Lord, to trust in you alone. And help us, Lord, to believe that you are, in fact, the creator of the world and the author of history and the governor of our own stories. And Lord, may this give us a solid faith that even when we're scared, even when we're panicky, even when we're suffering great anguish, we don't cut and run. We don't grab a religious figurine or other ways of distraction or diversion or escape. But Lord, we might learn courage from you and derive courage from our faith in you and trust that even when horrible things happen that we can't explain or control, that you in fact still govern. Help us, Lord, to live in that place of faith and give us your Spirit, who is in fact the source of our faith. So hear our prayer now in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Save our papers, yes.
Sure.